The Biden administration signaled its priorities very quickly by appointing John Kerry as global climate envoy and rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. And with us tonight to discuss this and future national security threats presented by climate and energy is Sherri Goodman. She's a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first program in 2021 as part of the International Perspective Series. And this year we call it the Haynes and Boone 2021 International Perspective Series. I'm Jim Falk, president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And we've been hosting this series in partnership with the American Jewish Committee in Dallas for over 2 decades, identifying critical issues in U.S. foreign policy and then bringing them home to our members and the public. And I'd also like to take this moment to thank the American Jewish Committee's staff, and particularly their director, Joel Schwitzer, and the board of the AJC, because they've been terrific supporters and good friends throughout this long-standing partnership that I know will continue for many more decades. Haynes and Boone, the law firm here in Dallas, has been a terrific supporter of the World Affairs Council, and we are so grateful to them for stepping up and being the presenting sponsor for the 2021 International Perspective Series. I hope you'll keep up with our programs at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. You can do that by going to our website at dfwworld.org, or please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course that's DFW World as well. To ask questions, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and our moderator this evening will get to as many of them as possible. I'm so pleased this evening that Harriet Whitting could join us. She's the president of the board of the AJC Dallas. Harriet, I turn it over to you, and I look forward to tonight's program.
Thank you so much, Jim. Good evening. As president of the AJC Dallas, I'm delighted to welcome you as we continue on this long-standing partnership between AJC and the World Affairs Council. As an organization that is known by many as the State Department of the Jewish people, this partnership is a natural one. We also want to take the opportunity to recognize and thank you, Jim, who has been such a pleasure to work with over all these years. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to please join AJC and the Dallas Regional Chamber on the morning of March the 2nd for an exploration of international trade and the transatlantic relationship with Ambassador Ron Kirk, former U.S. Trade Representative, and Anne Michelle Asimakupulu, Vice Chair of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee. Please email dallas@ajc.org for more details, including how to RSVP. And Ray, I'd like to turn the program over to you and thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. The International Perspective Series is a nationally acclaimed forum that features distinguished speakers from world-renowned institutions who discuss topics involving U.S. foreign policy and national security. It was founded by Mel Cusin, and as both Jim and Harriet have said, it has become a collaborative effort between the DFW World Affairs Council and the American Jewish Committee. 2021 begins the 21st year of this successful collaboration, and the first year that the international law firm of Haynes and Boone will sponsor this series. Our speaker this evening is Sherri Goodman, who will address us on climate and national security. It is widely accepted that without Ms. Goodman, the U.S. defense establishment would be environmentally unconscious. She coined the term threat multiplier to describe the influence of a climate change on traditional issues of national and international security. This concept has fundamentally reshaped national discourse on the topic. Ms. Goodman has founded led or advised nearly a dozen research organizations on environmental and energy matters, national security, and public policy. She served as our nation's first Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She now serves as Senior Fellow at the Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Moderating the discussion this evening is Mike Anderson, who is the Senior Vice President of External Affairs, Government Relations, and Security with Cosmos Energy, which is a leading independent deepwater oil and gas exploration and production company based in Dallas. Mr. Anderson has over 30 years of experience in the British Civil Service, including the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. In addition, he has extensive experience with the chemical and nuclear weapons policy at the UK and was a founding leader of the UK's Department of Energy and Climate Change. Please join me in welcoming Sherri Goodman and Mike Anderson.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for the introductions. And tonight, Sherri and I have decided, I think, that the best way to lead off, Sherri coined one of my favorite expressions, phrases ever in relation to climate and security, which is the earth is not our enemy, but it still merits attention, which I think is the perfect way to capture the way Sherri has driven this agenda over the last 25 years or so. So I think what we thought tonight would be Sherri would give a short presentation, and then we would get into a conversation about those aspects that are most interesting both to the group, people, audience listening, and to ourselves. So Sherri, I think you're going to start off with your presentation on the latest thinking, which we're all very much looking forward to. So thank you, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mike, Harriet, Jim, everyone who has provided the introductions. It's a deep pleasure for me and a special privilege to be here with you all in Dallas. From my earliest childhood days, I was familiar with Dallas, and I had cousins in Dallas who my parents are Holocaust refugees, and they came to the U.S. via New York and Chicago. But I had other parts of my family who came, who sought refuge in New Zealand, and then one of them married a woman named Sherri, unrelated to me, in Dallas. And so from my earliest childhood days, Sherri and Werner King lived in Dallas, and he came and visited us regularly with his children, his daughter Sonia. And so I have great fond memories of Dallas and of the Jewish community in your great city. So thank you very much for all that you do. Such a robust program I saw you introduce there. It's very impressive. So thank you. It's a deep pleasure to be with you. Okay, well, let's talk about climate and national security. I'm going to tell you some stories, and then we hopefully can have a good conversation. Okay, so if we go to the first slide, I'm going to start with a little history here of about the convergence of national security and climate security. Maybe some of you have been around as long as I have. Remember the Cold War, where the greatest global challenge we faced was a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. Maybe you remember duck and cover, and many of the threats we faced during that era. I spent the first part of my career as a nuclear weapons analyst and working on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff for Senator Sam Nunn, who was chairman at the time, and overseeing the Department of Defense's and Energy's nuclear weapons complex, including facilities in Texas, like Pantex. And then, of course, the Cold War ended. We had a few halcyon years of working together with the Russians to build down their nuclear capability, build up diplomatic engagement across the globe. Then we had 9/11, entered the era of terrorist threats externally. Now we're in an era of terrorist threats internally as well as COVID. If you look on the lower part of this chart at the rise of attention to environmental matters, both the US and globally, you see during the period of the Cold War was also the period when we created the EPA, major environmental laws were passed, the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Air, Clean Water Act. Then in the 80s, beginning an era of global environmental attention, the Rio Summit, the Montreal Protocol, and then leading into the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And at around the same time, or earlier in the 2006-07, I began to look at the national security implications of climate change. Next slide. With a group of senior military leaders, retired 3 and 4 stars from all of our military services, all combatant commands, and we released the first report on the national security implications of climate change in 2007. And the top line from that report was really climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world, and will add to tensions even in stable regions. And we updated that report in 2014. The board's issued about a dozen reports on energy and water security as well. Next slide. Thank you. So a couple of years ago, the intelligence community looked in particular at the pathways by which climate change can pose a threat to national security, and it released this report in 2016. And I think this is important because this is sort of from the intelligence community. We're going to look later at the Biden administration has just asked for the first presidential national intelligence estimate on climate, which will use this report as its starting off point, but I'm sure go much further. But these 6 pathways here are important because they show you how climate change becomes a threat, increased risk to human health, threats to stability of countries, heightened social and political tensions, negative impacts on economic competitiveness, adverse effects on food, in particular food prices and availability, and then climate discontinuities are what we call tipping points of the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets breaking off, and a substantial surprise. Next slide, please. So today, unlike the Cold War, what are the greatest global challenges we faced? Well, it's COVID, of course, first and foremost, and I hope many of you are getting your vaccines. My mother just got her first one yesterday. The economy, the dire straits it's in, racial injustice, democracy under threat around the world and even in our own country, and all of it knit together by the challenge of climate change. Next slide. So what are those climate threat multipliers, as we say? Let's look at those just in a little bit more depth. Heat, all of you probably experienced that in Dallas. Temperatures have risen globally around the planet, and nowhere more so than in the polar regions, and certainly across our country over the recent decades. Persistent drought in many places in the world, including in the US Southwest. Year-round fire seasons now from higher temperatures. In the US, in the Northwest, in Alaska, parts of Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Australia, and many other places. Sea level rise in our coastal cities, that's going to put major urban areas in the US and around the world at substantial risk in coming years. Persistent flooding at sea levels and in inland areas, and then extreme weather events or storms, intensifying hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. We're going to look at the connection between COVID and climate. In the climate era, disease vectors have traveled more frequently, both because of rising temperatures. We now find certain diseases that were only in tropical zones in temperate zones, and also because of wildlife loss and biodiversity loss, and disruption in illegal trafficking in wildlife and more mixing of humans and animals, such as in the Wuhan wet markets. We find it easier for diseases to jump from animals to humans. That's increasing the zoonosis emergence. And we've known about this. This is from a 2016 report. But like most things, like 9/11, like Pearl Harbor, it takes a real crisis for us to wake up and realize how bad it really is. And that's a little bit where we are with climate as well. Okay, next. So this says our continued erosion, of wild spaces can lead to the jumping of diseases from animals to humans. Okay, next slide. Thank you very much. And then another secondary effect is the massive increase in migration globally, some of it driven by climate, both from Africa, which is suffering extensive in North Africa, food and water insecurity because of prolonged drought, desertification, and increased temperatures, as well as in Central and South America, where the collapse of the coffee crop, as well as increased storm activity from Colombia up through Central America and Honduras has cost livelihoods of millions in that region and sent families and children fleeing northward through Mexico into the United States. Even in our own country, we now have climate migration. In Alaska, we've had whole villages collapse into the sea. In southern Louisiana, in the bayou as well, there are villages that are being lost to rising sea levels. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to do a deep dive into the Arctic, both because it's a very interesting and rapidly changing area, and because I get to talk about some fun things that Mike has also had exposure to here. So the Arctic is changing faster than the rest of the planet, twice as fast. The sea ice, it is said, is dying, it's retreating, permafrost is collapsing, and temperatures are rising. Next slide, please. Now, in an earlier era, in the mid-1990s, when I was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, I worked closely with the Russians, Norwegians, and others to help reduce nuclear and other risks in that area. And I ran a program called the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation with the Russians and Norwegians and others. And we built and deployed a cask to hold liquid waste streams from decommissioned Russian submarines. And I spent a lot of time in Russia. Next slide, please. As did Mike. And so I sometimes like to show these slides from my different visits to Russia. That's me there in the red suit, surrounded by the Russian and American generals. And then visiting I spoke at a number of Russian military academies. I actually got my MiG training wings when I flew a MiG simulator there on the left. But I like to tell the story of who is the designated drinker. Because it wasn't me. I learned quickly I couldn't keep up with the Russians. Plus, I was pregnant many times I went there. But I always found an American in that slide. You can see there. I always try to ask if you're a military aficionado, you can usually pick out which American in that slide was the designated drinker. But I'll let you guys guess. Michael guess when we get to the end. Okay, next slide. Okay. Did you want to hazard a guess right now, Mike?
No, I better not. I'll have to have a proper look.
Okay, you have a proper study of that, and then we'll come back. We'll put it like a little quiz,
We will.
Okay, so here's a map of the Arctic and the sea routes across the Arctic. As we say, it's increasingly open for commerce. The green line along Russia's coast is called the Northern Sea Route, and it's very shallow. Very treacherous, and Putin is trying to monetize it into a toll road for transit from ports in Asia across to ports in Europe. And the Canadian Northwest Passage, very treacherous. They consider it internal waters. But the Central Arctic route across the Central Arctic Ocean, which is not yet open, but could be in decades hence, would provide China greater access to this region. And also this region holds much of the planet's remaining undiscovered oil and gas revenues, as well as minerals, and as fisheries migrate northward, ultimately the fish. Next slide. China also has Arctic ambitions. It declared itself a near Arctic stakeholder, and a couple of years ago when it issued its first Arctic policy, has ambitions to connect its vast Belt and Road Initiative that stretches road and rail and maritime transit, not only across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, but ultimately across the Arctic in a polar silk route. It's heavily invested with Russia at the Yamal liquid natural gas facility and elsewhere as well. Russia needs the foreign investment. China needs to learn how to operate in the Arctic, and it needs the energy resources and potentially the shorter shipping times it can gain from a polar route. Next slide. So I sometimes talk about what keeps me up at night. You know, now it's not a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviets, but it is potentially a nuclear accident when a Russian nuclear icebreaker escorting a Chinese liquid natural gas vessel through the very narrow Bering Strait that separates Alaska and Russia by only 30 miles at its narrowest point, potentially has an incident. This was a scenario exercise we did a couple of years ago with a Department of Energy nuclear weapons lab, as well as the National Academy of Sciences, to look using these graphs you see on the left, which posit how the sea ice decline in 21st century transarctic shipping routes open in coming decades under various climate scenarios. And there, of course, is a Russian nuclear icebreaker. They have 40 nuclear powered vessels across the Arctic, including a nuclear powered floating power plant. Next slide. Okay, well, it's not only the Arctic that's changing, but the Middle East and North Africa, an area that's traditionally been rich in oil, but poor in water and becoming more so. Next slide. And if you overlay in Africa the places where of greatest instability and where the US in the last decade has deployed mostly special operations and other forces to help stem that insecurity and instability, it lines up completely with the areas of also climate vulnerability. You can see here in Mali, Niger, the Lake Chad Basin, once a very rich and productive area straddling 4 nations, now home in Nigeria to Boko Haram and other terrorist groups, that the combination of drought, desertification, deforestation, mismanagement of water, environmental degradation, food insecurity has magnified that instability and terrorism in that region. Next slide. Syria is a particularly important story in the connection between climate and security, because the drought, prolonged drought that preceded that conflict was a fundamental part of that deep conflict and the outward migration of Syrians into Europe. The prolonged drought that occurred starting in 1988 in various episodes reduced the ability of farmers and herders in the countryside peaceably to develop their livelihoods, and sent many farmers and herders into the urban areas, which led to civil unrest when there weren't enough jobs to employ them. And then, of course, Saddam Hussein and others took advantage of those that political unrest, led to the deadliest conflict in modern times. Next slide. Okay, coming back home, we'll talk a little bit now about impacts of climate change on the U.S. military, and then we'll go into the new Biden administration executive order from last week. Okay. We have military bases all around the world. We have many, of course, in the United States, lots there in Texas as well, and all are subject to various climate threat multipliers, from flooding, extreme weather, temperature, drought, wildfire. This is from a Department of Defense study of a couple of years ago that identified those, particularly along the eastern seaboard. You've got a lot of bases you see on the right that are subject to sea level rise, storm surge, and coastal inundation. Next slide. And in recent years, we've had, in 2019, we had 3 major bases that suffered billion-dollar losses from hurricanes and climate aggravated storms. Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, Camp Lejeune, a major Marine Corps training base in North Carolina, and not on this slide is Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. So taxpayers are already paying to rebuild these bases and many others. Next slide. And now there's some new guidance from the from Congress to the Department of Defense last year that requires all these bases in the US and overseas to prioritize climate resilience and then increase the investment. So in some ways, Department of Defense is going to lead by example in building climate resilient infrastructure. Next slide. Okay, what about climate impacts on military operations? Okay, so if we think back to D-Day and how fundamental the weather forecast was in determining the actual date of the major military operation that turned the tide of World War II, it was all about the weather. Eisenhower was going to launch on June 4th, and because of the weather forecast and the meteorologist predictions, he held off, and there was a narrow window on June 6th, surprised the Germans, turned the tide of the war. Okay, so weather forecasting has always been fundamental to military planning. Now we live in an era where weather forecasts are much less predictable because of climate instability. And so it becomes even more important that we improve our predictive capabilities for not just weather, but what's now called short-term climate prediction. Next slide. Our troops train like they fight, and a lot of that training is done, for example, at Fort Hood, there in Texas, other places in the Southwest, and the health effects of heat to the US military have already cost over $1 billion alone between 2008 and 2018. And now we attempt to deploy in certain areas where it is almost too hot for human habitation, and increasingly so. Next slide. So we have more Black Flag days. Now in the climate era, that's when temperatures are over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and our troops can't safely train. Next slide. And then our forces increasingly are responding to domestic natural disasters, from hurricanes to floods to wildfires. And that has even slowed the flow of our forces overseas, starting as recently as several years ago. Next slide. Okay, so what about the positive? There's a lot of technology innovation happening in Department of Defense, from improved predictive capabilities to renewables, solar, wind-powered drones for ocean mapping, and much more. Next slide. Not only is the US looking at climate and security, but we now have an international group of military leaders. I co-chair this with the former Dutch Chief of Defense, who are raising attention to climate and security internationally. We've issued several reports this week, we issued 2 reports on climate and security in South Asia and Southeast Asia. We've also done several on Brazil, other regions of the world, and a World Climate Security Report. So we're rallying organizations around the world to address these challenges. Next slide. And here we looked at those global impacts. We've just talked about some of those around the world. In the Indo-Pacific, a lot of it is the melting glaciers in the Himalayas threaten fresh water supply. China also controls the headwaters of Asia. That's another problem. And then of coastal populations extremely vulnerable to flooding in places like Bangladesh, the Philippines, and many of the small Pacific Island nations. Existential threat. Okay, next slide. Okay, we've looked at a whole security threat assessment of global climate change about a year ago. That was one of the underlying assessments used in the recent Biden executive order. So you can see a little better here on the next slide. There we go, the security threat profile. So when you when you evaluate climate change, you looked at various emission scenarios. We already have baked into our planetary system at least 1.5 degrees of warming. So if we really begin to get the planetary house in order and can keep warming to 1 to 2 degrees centigrade above baseline levels over the next coming decades, this is kind of the level of risk we face, which is still very high around the planet, particularly in certain regions of the world, particularly the Middle East and Asia. If we exceed those thresholds, and on the next slide, are more at what the medium long term with that we call uncurbed warming, 2 to 4 degrees above current temperatures. The risks are catastrophic really in every region of the world, from extreme heat, water stress, widespread displacement, disease and malnutrition, extreme weather events, as you can see on the slide. Next slide, which is why this has been so important to the incoming administration. These were our recommendations in a climate security plan for America that we issued starting last year and continue to update presidential leadership. And that's already happening. Rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. That's happened day one. And then also it's about the people, climate champions and security personnel throughout the government. Of course, we know in the last administration, climate was a 4-letter word. So people who were working on it, people in my former office in the Pentagon or intelligence community, either had to use other words, kind of go underground, or I did what we called the Keeping Hope Alive projects. Okay, and now hope is alive. Next slide, please. This was sort of the 4 parts of our climate security plan for America. Demonstrate leadership, assess risk, support our allies and our partners, very important, and prepare for and prevent climate impacts. And so on the next slide, we'll see sort of some of the key elements in the executive order issued last week on tackling the climate crisis. First, it's a whole of government approach to climate strategies and plans. Sort of every federal agency, all the national security agencies, Department of Defense, Intelligence Community, State Department, where the president was today, all have to integrate climate into their plans. Then, as I said, the first presidentially directed national intelligence estimate of climate change is underway. And in the Department of Defense, they're going to do a climate risk analysis, both of infrastructure and of missions. That's important because it's not only what happens to our bases and our stations, but it's also how we think about it when we're deploying in the Pacific, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Latin America. Next slide, please. Okay, and then this is also related, integrating climate change across all of the various agencies, and then establishing a climate national security working group, which will be an interagency effort. Next slide. And some other big things that are important, of course, rejoining the Paris Agreement, green jobs in a clean energy economy, establishing a green jobs in conservation, including in a civilian climate corps that takes its cue from the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps, and then elevating attention to environmental justice. Next slide. I think we're at the end. Oh, okay. And here just our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has put out a very good statement on that, supporting the president's direction, acknowledging climate risk to national security. And I love his last sentence. He said, "There's little about what the department does to defend the American people that is not affected by climate change. It is a national security issue, and we must treat it as such." That's a whole new day in the Pentagon. And so America is back, and climate security is back on the table as an important issue. And with that, I think that was my last slide. Thank you, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. That was very clear and a full description across the whole agenda, really. It's an enormous agenda, and you've taken us through very quickly, I think, both the history, where US policies, how US policy has developed, how DoD is particularly engaged, and then global security. Just a first question from me, and other people will now please put your questions into us. But the first one for me is actually a slightly personal one, and you sort of referred to keeping hope alive. Back in the day when you were first starting out on this, there were probably even more skeptics and more people uncertain why are we even having this conversation. I'd be just interested in how you took that personal journey and turned it into this important key element now of security strategy and global strategy, and the sorts of people that you faced when you were trying to get those arguments over to the people that were going to implement the policies that you were talking about.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, when I served in the Department of Defense in the 1990s, climate was not actually the first thing on our mind. That came around sort of later, towards the end of my tenure. We were first dealing with cleanup of military bases from industrial contamination and compliance with air, water, and waste issues. And I'll tell you what really got the attention of military commanders and base commanders was if they could be fined or held liable for a violation. So that really got people's attention, and that could happen because there were criminal fines that had occurred under the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act had stopped training at Fort Bragg. So that led to an era of, okay, let's not just complain about it. Let's not just fight these lawsuits, but let's figure out how we could do that. So the Department of Defense, for example, converted from litigating about the training at Fort Bragg to being able to use the red-cockaded woodpecker that nested in this longleaf pine that had been cut down on some of those Southeast military bases as a realistic training obstacle. So then they became the bird's, best savior. Because most military bases really are islands of nature. I made it my personal mission to engage with the 4 stars, the military leaders of each of the services and the others that I had to work with, because I knew that I had to build that trust and cooperation. Sometimes say, things move at the speed of trust. So these 4 stars became, I really worked hard at that. Now they became some of my closest colleagues and some of them deep personal friends. So then fast forward, I left the Pentagon and climate is getting more attention. And I get asked to look at the national security implications of climate change. And I asked these 4 stars, a dozen of them, to come and join me in this journey to learn about that. Most of them were climate skeptics at the time. They were like, Sherri, I'm a war fighter. I don't have anything to do with climate change.
Yeah.
And so, but they said, okay, if you say this is important and you're at a respected think tank. At the time, I was the Center for Naval Analysis, which is the in-house think tank for the Navy, Marine Corps, and others. And so we spent a year on a journey, including going to the UK, meeting with the UK Ministry of Defense, the Met Office, others, scientists, learning from the world's leading climate scientists. And at the end of that, they came up with, they were concerned that this is something we are not paying enough attention to. And this is why we're having more deployments, because more and more people are vulnerable to terrorists who are taking advantage of food and water insecurity with increased drought and desertification, particularly prevalent at the time across Middle East and North Africa, but now elsewhere as well. So everyone has their own aha moment on the journey. And, I really say, my aha moment has really been having been a Cold Warrior working with the Russians on nuclear build down, and now to see an Arctic that is ripe for global competition. It's a different world today up there.
That's fascinating, Sherri, and you've obviously spoken to many people over the years, and you will have met a lot of skeptics. There's a question coming in from Mike Herman here, which is the one that you will have heard many times before, about how you separate in the science man-made emissions versus naturally occurring emissions. to me, it never mattered in the end. If the world is globally warming, it's globally warming now, and the proportion is not important to completely. But where do you stand on that, and where does the science take you over the years that you've been engaged with those leading scientists, such as one we talked about the other day, Sir Bob Watson and the IPCC,
Right.
and what they've explained to you about why we are, those who are looking at it, so convinced that we are in a different era now, a different age of climate change?
Well, if you take your starting point, the threats and risks that we face globally, I love the way a former commandant of the Coast Guard, who I've worked with on Arctic matters, put it, when he testified before climate skeptics, and he said, well, look, Senator, there's water now in places there didn't used to be, and there's no ice where there used to be ice. So that's just the facts. I got to deal with the facts on the ground. Okay. Now we have increasingly our forces are deployed at home to rescue people from the hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria and Irma, and the flooding. And the damage to the military bases is unmistakable. I mean, we have the Hurricane Michael, I think that destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base. The hangars there for the F-35s were built to withstand winds of, I think, 115 miles an hour, and the wind reached over 130 miles an hour, taking off the roofs of some of the hangars and damaging some of the very expensive aircraft. Fortunately, no lives were lost. So, the engineering standards that we have used in the past have changed. They have. And, we could argue all day how much of it is natural versus man-made. But at the end of the day, we still have to protect ourselves from those risks, from those changing conditions.
I see Ray has asked a question already here about what would be the plan in the Arctic. Ray, can you put your question back up? It's come up and then go back down again.
What should a U.S. climate security plan in the Arctic include?
That's it. There you go.
Well, that's a great question, Ray. So a climate security plan in the Arctic, first of all, will recognize that that climate change is a shaping force of Arctic change. We've had a number of Arctic strategies released, some just in the last weeks of the last administration, which never mentioned the word climate change. So, and if you don't recognize reality, you can't deal with the real threat. Okay, so now, of course, that's going to change. But what does that mean? Well, we have we have increasing number of military exercises occurring in the region, Russian exercises, NATO exercises, US exercises. This creates more risk for an accident or a miscalculation. Just last summer in a Russian exercise in the Bering Sea, they buzzed a number of fishermen in US economic zone. And when they contacted the US Coast Guard as to what they should do, the Coast Guard said, well, you better get out of there because we're too far away to come and help you. Now, okay, so there wasn't any loss of life, but increasing aggressive behavior can lead, we know, to miscalculation. So what we need to go back, in my view, we need to reinstate some of the confidence building measures that we use to manage the nuclear threats during the Cold War, when we had a period of very low trust with the Russians, but we still wanted to avoid an all-out nuclear attack. Now, how do you develop confidence building measures today when we know we don't trust the Russians any more than we did then, maybe less so? We got the Chinese, okay? But we still have to be able to deconflict our forces and ensure that we protect civilian life. I've called recently in a report that we released just last week with the Norwegian, a Norwegian think tank done for the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. We called for developing a code of conduct for military forces operating in the Arctic, so that there'd be a little more early warning and notice. That's one of the things that there's a lot of lack of transparency. And that's even more difficult in the Arctic than anywhere else because there's poor communications. above certain degrees latitude. And so we just need to have some ways of deconflicting. We already have a very good Arctic Coast Guard form. The Coast Guards of the various Arctic nations already work together to manage this. There's an Arctic Council, which is not a governance body per se, but since 1996, when it was established, it has served as a forum for the 8 Arctic coastal nations, plus many other observers, including China and also indigenous groups and others, to come together on a common agenda that includes things like trade, shipping, environmental matters, education, everything except security. And it's been a constructive way for the Arctic nations to continue to communicate about sustainable development for the people of the Arctic and about how to manage economic matters as the Arctic opens up. That should continue, become more robust. And as I said, at the same time, we have to plan for how to manage, reduce the risk on the security side while recognizing the low trust relations, the low trust that we have with both Russia and China at the present time.
Thank you, Sherri. Could I open it up a bit and use a couple of questions that have come in and relate it to sort of US foreign policy, if you like, and where the US is going to go with this? Because I think it was Megan O'Sullivan at the Kennedy School said John Kerry will disrupt, in her words, US foreign policy, with it infusing, you just said the same thing in your presentation, every foreign policy initiative that the US is now going to be looking at it from through a different lens. And Sally's asked sort of what other countries see the threat from climate change in the same way? Who've actually really that attuned to what you're talking about? And it sort of relates to a question that Stephen's asked that you might tie into it in a way, which is that there's no question that climate change poses serious security issues, but how are the US going to make progress globally when China and Russia, 2 countries you've referred to quite often, particularly in relation to the Arctic, but more generally, have very different political agendas? So how is US foreign policy going to play out against this, against the whole set of nations, and in particular against the big players, Russia and China?
Okay, well, let's start with China, because China is an increasingly aggressive and ambitious globally, purports to offer a set of values very different than our own, and to change the rules of the globally based order. So they're probably our greatest long-term threat as a nation. Now, they're taking advantage of climate change in all of their foreign policies and outreach by building up atolls in the South China Sea as waters make those available, by becoming a provider of natural disaster relief and humanitarian assistance to vulnerable Pacific nations, Pacific Island nations. And the US has the opportunity now to regain its leadership in this region by re-engaging with those allies and partners across the whole region, by offering not only its climate leadership, but its economic leadership. Now, we're in an era of an energy transition, and we have to compete with China on that energy transition because they've become, of course, a major manufacturer of solar and other renewable technologies. They're, of course, stealing our stuff every moment, you turn around. And so we've got to lead and compete in those areas. We have to be the innovator of choice and also the manufacturer of choice in the new energy economy. As a national security professional, I think about all the innovations through the Cold War that came out of the military and intelligence communities, from the internet, global positioning systems, all of those that have made our civilian life so much faster and better, right? That trend reversed, as you know, over the last decade, where civilian technology development, it was sort of, it was coming into the Defense Department as opposed to the other way around. Now, I don't know that we're going to turn that around, but the Defense Department still is a big buyer. Let's talk about electric vehicles, okay? You know, China's already buying lots of electric vehicles. Who should be making those cars? We should. And GM now has already announced that it's going to have all electric fleet by 2030. The Defense Department's one of the 3 biggest buyers in the federal fleet, the others being the Postal Service and the General Services Administration. So, you know, when DoD starts buying, you know, electric vehicles, that helps make a market. And that's true in other areas as well. So it's innovation, it's buying power, and then it's leading by example. I mean, military bases are small communities, big communities, small communities, all around the country with all the same problems and challenges that we all face as Americans, whether it's coastal sea level rise or even non-environmental issues, family issues, tensions and issues. And so working with communities is also very important because we have to build this together. You know, the utility systems are all interconnected. We usually get our power on base from off the base, the water, the sewer systems, all of that infrastructure, which is now being made more resilient to extreme weather events, and also changing the way we buy and build our energy systems.
That's you alluded in there, Sherri, and Ron's asked the question, and I belong to part of the wicked side of the world, the oil and gas industry, that's going to have to change how it approaches what we're doing, and we're looking at it very carefully, as you'd expect us to, and are now going to fully engage on it if many of us weren't before. And he's asked a question, given that potential impact of climate change, both global security, but also on the impact on the global economy, how do you see, what do you believe the business community truly recognizes that threat, fully engaged, and how do you encourage that nexus that you were talking about between private sector and military to build the Tesla tank or whatever it is that would need to be in the right technological space for what's going to happen on climate? How do you get that engagement that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, we've got to expand efforts in the last few years, like the Defense Innovation Unit, to expand into this area of energy. I've called for a clean energy innovation office in the Department of Defense that really focuses on that, as well as a clean energy transition fund. One of the big challenges, incentive fund, one of the challenges for the Department of Defense here is that it's great at developing technology in partnership with private industry, but then it actually has to use it. So if you've got the submarine, the tank, the weapon system that needs it, that provides that what we call demand signal to buy it. That's why you've got the big defense contractors and all their suppliers. But if it's simply about how we power the base or make more resilient the building, sometimes that's the last to get paid for. That's often what we call the bill payer in the Department of Defense. I know because I used to own those accounts, and I was always having to shell out my money for some increased readiness unit tax over here. So we have to rethink about the readiness here. And there are a lot of pressures on the defense budget now, don't get me wrong. I mean, in all accounts. So, and they'll continue to be so. And at the same time, I think, the oil and gas industry has a lot of tech innovation in it too. I mean, you're talking about, look, we're going unmanned for a lot of our missions, as you know. Yep. A lot of that unmanned technology has already been developed in the oil and gas industry. It's going to have a lot more application for our maritime forces in particular, but not only maritime and space forces. And so I think you have a lot to offer there. I mean, the ocean is a very wired place, increasingly so. I could have given a whole talk about just the ocean and maritime part of this, but I think where in the industry you're in, there's going to be a lot of need and a lot of opportunity there.
Mike Kerman's asked about whether we're hurting our military security forces by forcing electric vehicles. Really talking about the minerals needed for battery production, which of course, China, the rare earths issue. Where do you stand on the rare earths issue and how one gets into the right space, given the potential risks we have of going down the wrong track of technology that forces us into a route that we can't actually provide?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I have spent a little time looking at the whole supply chain um, for rare earths and for electric vehicles, and that is a security challenge in itself. And we have got to figure that out. Um, and as we move forward, we don't want to find ourselves where we're overly dependent on China for the rare earths to supply our electric vehicle industry. So we are developing some mining capacity in the US, and we're looking at other suppliers, but we're going to have to develop other pieces of the supply chain as well that are not as secure yet, and that has to be a part of this. It's not only about the end product, it's about the whole supply chain. Yeah.
Can I ask you one more question before Jim comes in, Sherri, which is whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about that huge change that you're talking about, and what is it, technological, cultural, personnel, military, security, economic. You studied it for many, many years. Where leave us with warm words about where it may go is what I'm hoping you're going to say.
Well, I am optimistic because I know the power and strength of American innovation and American ingenuity when we put ourselves to something. I mean, think of the Marshall Plan. Think of our space race. Think of how we won the Cold War. Or, I think even in my own experience, the Department of Defense went from being seen as an environmental laggard when I joined it in the early 1990s. And by the time I left in 2001, was recognized as an environmental and clean energy leader, and still is today. And I think it can still be so. It doesn't solve all of our global challenges, but it can in addressing its issues and still preparing the best fighting force, the best women and men fighting force in the world, can do so in a way that makes our fighting force and our nation more resilient.
Well, I always like when we end a program hearing the adjective best and resilient. And our North Star on this IPS series is Mel Cusin, who always wanted this program to focus on timely, critical issues on U.S. foreign policy. And we've certainly done that tonight. Thank you so much, Sherri. Thank you, Mike, for sitting in the armchair. And want to remind everyone, do please go to dfwworld.org to keep up with our programs or catch up on them by going to our YouTube channel, also at DFW World. And if you'd like to support any of our programs, please give me a call or just go to our website and and send an email to Alana Buenrostro. And our staff has been very busy this week. This is our third program, and I want to give special thanks to Rachel Vogel and Kirsten Kuhlenberg and Caroline Fangman for their hard work to make this week so successful. Have a great weekend and stay safe.